I woke up to the sound of buzzing. Not the usual comforting hum of my bees, but something more frantic, more angry. At first, I thought it was just another morning in my little paradise of honey making. The sun was rising, casting a golden glow over my backyard, where my hives stood like sentinels. The air was thick with the scent of wildflowers and the promise of a new day. But something felt off. I stretched, rubbed the sleep from my eyes, and shuffled into the kitchen to start my morning routine. That's when I saw it. My jars, my precious golden jars of honey, were gone. The wooden shelves where I had carefully placed them were nearly empty, save for a few sticky smudges and a single overturned lid on the floor. My heart skipped a beat, then began to pound in my chest like a drum. I ran to the window, my bare feet slapping against the cool tile, and that's when I saw her. Margaret, my entitled, boundary-stomping neighbor, smugly loading the stolen jars into her SUV like they were groceries she had paid for. She didn't even bother to sneak around. No guilt, no hesitation. She wiped a smudge of honey off the lid with her sleeve, licked it off her finger, and smiled. The audacity of that woman could power a city. My hands clenched into fists, and a dozen possible reactions raced through my mind. Call the cops? Confront her? Release the bees? The last option seemed extreme, but at that moment, I wasn't against a little nature-backed justice. Margaret had always been a thorn in my side. She was the type who thought fences were just suggestions and other people's property was up for debate. She had taken my garden tools, borrowed my wheelbarrow for months, and once even threw a party that ended with a broken gate and an overturned beehive. That day, I had to chase down a cloud of bees for hours, calming them like an overworked mother. But this was a different level. My honey wasn't just some backyard hobby. It was my livelihood, my pride, my passion. And Margaret had stolen it like it was a free sample at the grocery store. I stormed out the back door, fully prepared to unleash the kind of verbal wrath that would make a sailor blush. But by the time I reached the driveway, she was already backing out, waving at me like we were old friends. "Thanks for the honey, Clara," she called, flashing her too white, too fake smile. "It's amazing. You should really sell it at the farmer's market." I stood there, stunned, my brain trying to process the sheer level of carelessness I had just witnessed. Sell it at the market? She had stolen my honey and was now giving me business advice. As her car disappeared down the road, my mind went from shock to strategy. I wasn't just going to let this go. No. I had a rule. Mess with my garden, I'll scowl at you. Mess with my bees, I'll give you a warning. But mess with my honey, and you just declared war. I walked back inside, my anger simmering into something sharper, something more focused. If Margaret wanted honey so badly, I'd make sure she got it, just not in the way she expected. I had an idea. A beautifully ironic, slightly evil idea. But first, I needed to check on my hive. The bees were restless, their usual gentle buzzing tinged with irritation. They could tell something was off. Maybe they had felt the disturbance in their sacred honey supply, or maybe they just sensed my mood. Either way, they were with me. I leaned against the hive, looking out over my backyard, formulating the plan. Margaret was predictable in the worst way. She took without asking, assumed she was above consequences, and never, ever admitted when she was wrong. That was about to change. Because if she loved my honey so much, I was going to give her more than she could handle. The first step was a little preparation. I needed the special honey, the one infused with a certain blend of natural pheromones. Normally, I used it to help guide lost bees back to their hive, but today it had a new purpose. That night, I barely slept. I kept imagining Margaret's face when she realized what was happening, the slow dawning horror as she realized the bees weren't just visiting, they were targeting. I was giddy with anticipation. The next morning, I set my trap. I left the jar in the usual spot, right on the shelf where she had stolen from before. I didn't even bother hiding it. If there was one thing I could count on, it was Margaret's greed. And sure enough, by noon, she had struck again. But this time, things would be different. An hour later, as I sat on my porch with a cup of tea, I heard it, the distant, high-pitched shriek of someone in distress. I set my cup down and walked to the fence, peeking over just in time to see Margaret flailing wildly in her backyard. Her brunch guests were scattering in terror. The bees had arrived. At first, it was just a few, drawn by the irresistible scent of the honey she had so generously smeared all over her charcuterie board. But then, As if summoned by the universe itself, more began to arrive, dozens, hundreds. Margaret was screaming, running in circles, knocking over tables and bowls. Her perfectly curated backyard descended into chaos. I watched as she tried to swat them away, which of course only made them angrier. Her guests were fleeing, shielding their mimosas as they sprinted for the house. One man dove into the pool, a dramatic leap worthy of an action movie. Another tripped over a chair and rolled into a hedge. Margaret, still running, still flailing, was absolutely covered in bees. I should have felt bad. Really, I should have. But as I stood there, sipping my tea, watching karma do its thing, I couldn't help but smile. It was beautiful. Poetic justice in its purest form. And the best part? This was just the beginning. Margaret had no idea what was coming. After watching her flee from her own brunch like a villain in a cartoon, I knew one thing for certain. This wasn't over. Margaret never backed down, never admitted defeat. She wasn't the type to learn from her mistakes. No, she was the type to get angry, to blame others, to seek revenge. And I had no doubt that after she finished icing her stings and wiping the remnants of her disaster brunch off her overpriced yoga pants, she would be plotting her next move, which meant I needed to be 2 steps ahead. The thing about dealing with people like Margaret was that you couldn't just win once. You had to win in a way that made them never want to play the game again. And that required a level of patience, strategy, and just the right amount of chaos. Fortunately, I had all 3. A few days later, just as I was beginning to enjoy the rare piece, I found an envelope taped to my front door. The second I saw the fancy embossed lettering on the front, I knew it was trouble. Nobody sends good news in an envelope that looks expensive. With a sigh, I tore it open and pulled out a stack of neatly printed papers. And then I saw it. Margaret was suing me for emotional distress, for negligence, for damages. I had to read it twice just to make sure my eyes weren't deceiving me. She was claiming that my bees had recklessly and intentionally attacked her, that I had orchestrated an unsafe environment, and that somehow I was responsible for the disaster that had unfolded in her backyard. The woman who had stolen from me, who had trespassed on my property multiple times, was now trying to drag me into court over bees. I let out a slow breath, resisting the overwhelming urge to laugh. This was classic Margaret. When she couldn't win, she whined. When she couldn't control a situation, she turned it into a spectacle. And now she was trying to flip the narrative, painting herself as the innocent victim of a bee-based attack. But here's the thing about Margaret. She always underestimated people. She assumed everyone around her was either too stupid, too weak, or too afraid to fight back. And that was her biggest mistake. A week later, I found myself sitting in a small courtroom, watching as Margaret, wearing a neck brace that I was certain was just for dramatic effect, recounted her trauma. She dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, acting like she had survived some kind of horror movie rather than a minor inconvenience caused entirely by her own greed. "They chased me," she whined, her voice trembling just enough to sound rehearsed. "I couldn't escape. It was a nightmare." I folded my arms, waiting for my turn to speak. The judge, a middle-aged man who looked like he had dealt with more than his fair share of ridiculous cases, turned his tired gaze to me. "Do you have a response to these allegations?" I stood, cleared my throat, and smiled politely. "Yes, Your Honor. I have security footage." The room went silent. Margaret's face froze mid-fake sniffle. I reached into my bag, pulled out a USB drive, and handed it to the bailiff. Seconds later, the video began playing on the courtroom's monitor. There was Margaret, sneaking into my backyard, stealing the honey, and smirking like she had just won the lottery. The footage was crystal clear. It showed her rummaging through my shelves, tucking jars into her purse, and walking away without a hint of remorse. And then, for added effect, I had included a second clip, the brunch disaster. The court watched as Margaret screamed, flailed, and sprinted through her yard while guests toppled furniture and dove into pools. It was chaos in high definition. And the best part? The bees weren't attacking. They were just there, drawn to the honey she had so enthusiastically smeared over everything. When the video ended, the judge leaned forward, rubbing his temples as if he had just developed a massive headache. "Miss Margaret," he said, his voice dripping with exhaustion, "I have a few questions. Did you, or did you not, steal honey from the defendant?" Margaret opened her mouth, then closed it, opened it again, then let out a strangled noise that sounded like a mix between a cough and a whimper. The judge sighed. I'll take that as a yes. And did the defendant, at any point, send the bees to attack you? I mean, Miss Margaret, the judge interrupted, his tone sharp. Did she? Margaret deflated like a balloon. No, Your Honor. The judge nodded, then shuffled some papers before looking directly at her. I'm dismissing this case, and I strongly advise you to stay off your neighbor's property unless you want to be dealing with real legal trouble. I had to bite the inside of my cheek to keep from grinning. Margaret turned redder than a sunburn, but for once, she didn't argue. She just huffed, grabbed her ridiculous designer bag, and stormed out of the courtroom. A few days later, I was out in my yard, tending to my hives, when I saw her. Margaret, standing by her car, looking at me like she wanted to say something but couldn't quite bring herself to. For a split second, I thought maybe, just maybe, she was going to apologize. But instead, she scoffed, turned on her heel, and stomped into her house. I smiled, shaking my head. Some people really never learned. As I turned back to my bees, watching them buzz around their hive, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The honey was safe, the bees were happy, and Margaret? Well, she'd think twice before messing with me again. And if she didn't, well, I had plenty more honey where that came from. In the weeks that followed, Margaret avoided me like the plague. No dramatic confrontations, no fake pleasantries, not even a passive-aggressive comment about my garden being overgrown. It was almost eerie. She barely left her house, and when she did, she moved quickly, constantly glancing over her shoulder as if the bees were still lurking, waiting to strike. I had expected some kind of retaliation, maybe an over-the-top complaint to the homeowners association or a vague threat about calling animal control. But instead, I got silence. And that, more than anything, told me I had won. The honey war was over, and I had emerged victorious. The weeks following the courtroom victory were blissfully quiet. Margaret, for once, kept to herself. No more stolen honey, no more trespassing, no more passive-aggressive comments about my garden. It was as if the bees had finally taught her a lesson she couldn't ignore. I spent my days tending to my hives, harvesting honey, and enjoying the peace that had settled over my little corner of the world. But peace, as I would soon learn, is a fragile thing. It started with a letter, not the kind taped to my front door, but a formal, typed letter delivered by a courier. The envelope was thick, the kind that feels heavy with bad news. I opened it with trembling hands, my heart sinking as I read the contents. Margaret was at it again. This time, she wasn't suing me, she was rallying the neighborhood against me. The letter was a petition, signed by a dozen of my neighbors, demanding that I remove my hives. The reasons were laughable: danger to children, nuisance to the community, unsafe environment. It was all nonsense, of course, but it didn't matter. Margaret had found a new way to attack me, and she was using the one thing I couldn't fight alone: public opinion. I crumpled the letter in my hands, my mind racing. This wasn't just about honey anymore. This was about survival, my bees' survival, and my own. The petition led to a neighborhood meeting, held in the community center on a chilly Tuesday evening. I arrived early, clutching a folder filled with documents, photos, and testimonials from local beekeepers and environmentalists. I was prepared to fight, but I wasn't prepared for the hostility that greeted me. The room was packed. Margaret sat at the front, flanked by her closest allies, a group of women who had never so much as waved at me before. They whispered among themselves, casting glances in my direction that ranged from pity to outright disdain. I took a seat near the back, my heart pounding as the meeting began. Margaret stood first, her voice dripping with false concern. We're here today because of a serious issue affecting our community. Clara's bees are a danger to our children, our pets, and our way of life. I've spoken to many of you, and the consensus is clear: the hives must go. The room erupted in murmurs of agreement. I clenched my fists under the table, forcing myself to stay calm. When it was my turn to speak, I stood slowly, my folder in hand. I understand your concerns. I began, my voice steady despite the anger bubbling beneath the surface. But the truth is, my bees are not a danger. They're vital to our ecosystem. Without bees, our gardens wouldn't thrive, our crops wouldn't grow, and our world would be a much less beautiful place. I handed out the documents, pointing to statistics about the decline of bee populations and the importance of urban beekeeping. I showed photos of my hives, explaining how they were carefully maintained and safely enclosed. I even had a letter from a local farmer thanking me for the role my bees played in pollinating his crops. But it wasn't enough. Margaret had planted seeds of fear, and fear is a powerful thing. By the end of the meeting, the vote was clear. The hives had to go. I left the meeting feeling defeated, but I wasn't ready to give up. That night, as I sat on my porch with a cup of tea, I heard a soft knock at the gate. I looked up to see a man standing there, his hands shoved into the pockets of his worn leather jacket. He was tall, with dark hair and a scruffy beard, and there was something about him that felt familiar. "Clara?" he asked, his voice low and gravelly. "Yes," I replied, wary but curious. "I'm Jack," he said. "I live a few blocks over. I was at the meeting tonight, and I just wanted to say, I'm on your side." I blinked, surprised. "You are?" He nodded, stepping closer. "I've been keeping bees for years. What Margaret's doing, it's not right. Bees are essential, and people like her are the reason they're disappearing. I want to help." For the first time in weeks, I felt a glimmer of hope. Jack and I spent the next few hours talking, sharing stories about our hives and brainstorming ways to fight back. By the time he left, I had a plan and a new ally. With Jack's help, I organized a community event, a day with the bees. We invited the neighborhood to come and see the hives up close, to learn about the importance of bees, and to taste the honey they produced. It was a risky move, but it was our best shot at changing minds. The day of the event was perfect, sunny and warm, with a gentle breeze that carried the scent of blooming flowers. Jack and I set up tables with jars of honey, informational pamphlets, and even a few beekeeping suits for the brave souls who wanted to get up close and personal with the hives. At first, the turnout was small. A few curious neighbors wandered in, their eyes wide with a mix of fear and fascination. But as the day went on, more people arrived. Children laughed as they tasted honey for the first time, their parents snapping photos and asking questions. Even a few of Margaret's allies showed up, though they kept their distance. Then, just as the event was winding down, Margaret appeared. She stood at the edge of the yard, her arms crossed, and her face a mask of disdain. I braced myself for a confrontation, but before I could say anything, Jack stepped forward. "Margaret," he said, his voice calm but firm, "why don't you come and see for yourself? The bees aren't the enemy. They're just trying to survive, like the rest of us." For a moment, she hesitated. Then, to my astonishment, she stepped forward. Jack handed her a beekeeping suit, and together, they approached the hives. I held my breath as Margaret peered inside, her expression unreadable. And then, something incredible happened. She smiled. The event was a turning point. Slowly but surely, the neighborhood began to come around. Margaret, much to my surprise, became one of my most vocal supporters. She even started her own hive, with Jack's help, and began selling honey at the farmer's market. But peace, as I had learned, is fragile. And just when I thought the battle was over, a new threat emerged. One morning, I woke up to find my hives vandalized. The wooden frames were smashed, the honeycombs destroyed, and the bees, my precious bees, were gone. I fell to my knees, tears streaming down my face as I surveyed the damage. Jack arrived within minutes, his face pale as he took in the scene. "Who would do this?" he asked, his voice trembling with anger. I didn't have to answer. We both knew. Margaret's newfound support had made her enemies, and someone had decided to take their anger out on me. The vandalism brought the neighborhood together in a way I never could have imagined. People I had never spoken to before showed up at my door, offering their help and their condolences. Even Margaret, who had once been my greatest adversary, stood by my side as we worked to rebuild the hives. But the fight wasn't over. The person responsible for the vandalism was still out there, and they weren't going to stop until the hives were gone for good. Jack and I decided to set a trap. We installed security cameras and spent nights watching the hives, waiting for the culprit to strike again. And then, one night, they did. We caught them red-handed, a man from the neighborhood, someone I had never suspected. He was angry, bitter, and convinced that the bees were a threat to his family. But as we confronted him, something unexpected happened. Margaret stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. "The bees aren't the problem," she said. "We are. We're the ones who've forgotten how to live in harmony with nature." But it's not too late to change. Her words struck a chord. The man lowered his tools, his anger giving way to shame. And in that moment, I realized that the real battle wasn't against Margaret or the neighborhood or even the vandal. It was against ignorance, fear, and the belief that we are separate from the natural world. The hives were rebuilt, stronger than ever. The neighborhood came together to create a community garden with the bees at its heart. Margaret and I became unlikely friends, united by our love of honey and our shared belief in the power of second chances. As for Jack, well, let's just say he became more than just an ally. But that's a story for another time. The honey war was over, but the lessons it taught us would last a lifetime. And as I stood in my yard, watching the bees buzz happily around their hive, I knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, we would face them together. Thank you for taking the time to listen to today's story on Store of Good Stories. If this story touched your heart or made you think, don't forget to hit like and share the video to spread this positive message to more people. And if this is your first time here, make sure to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss any of the meaningful stories we share every week. Your support is the biggest motivation for Store of Good Stories to keep bringing heartfelt and valuable stories to you. See you in the next video.